Hey everybody, welcome to Undivided Live. Today we're talking about inclusive IEP goals. So if your child is in a gen ed class for the majority of their day, how can their IEP goals ensure they aren't removed from the classroom for goal work? And does it matter if they aren't performing on grade level? If your child's in a special ed classroom and you're looking for more meaningful, inclusive opportunities, how can your goals support those needs? And what if your IEP team has no idea how to write or envision inclusive goals? We're going to give you 4 easy steps on how to tackle your child's goals with inclusion in mind. We're going to share a template that can help your child build or break down goals, and we'll identify red flags to watch for before you sign that IEP. I'm Lindsay Crane, and I head the content and community teams at Undivided. With me today, we welcome back Dr. Solone. Dr. Solone is a teacher, educator, and faculty within UCLA's Disability Studies Department. She's also an inclusion consultant to school districts around California and a sibling to a beautiful human who happens to have CP. Welcome back, Dr. Solone.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. It's so nice to be back with y'all.
So if you still have questions after our talk today, our Undivided navigators would love to help. They can walk you through a personalized step-by-step guide detailing your biggest priorities around inclusion, goals, and IEP prep. And if you don't even know where to start, they can help with that too. But right now, let's talk about how to write inclusive IEP goals. So every student can have inclusive goals regardless of their classroom placement. And there are several kinds of goals, and we're going to touch on each. So academic goals like reading or math, related service goals like speech or OT, and non-academic goals like socialization and behavior. So we're going to talk about how each of these fit into the 4 steps parents can take when considering IEP goals and how they support inclusion. But first, Dr. Solone, how are you defining inclusive goals?
I'm defining inclusive IEP goals as IEP goals that work to help us and the IEP team work on academic and social skills in the natural, inclusive general education setting. So these are goals, they don't have to necessarily be worked on in a general education setting or in inclusive settings, say on campus, like in lunch and things like that. But it's important to consider writing goals that can be worked on in those settings so that the goals are not a barrier to inclusive opportunities.
Why do inclusive goals matter?
Inclusive goals are so important because I can't tell you how many times there have been families or students who either the team wants to see included more or the family would like to see included more. And the justification that's received is oftentimes, well, they need to work on goal work and they have these IEP goals, and these IEP goals can't be worked on in the context of a general education classroom. And while oftentimes that's actually not true, we can make it work in many cases. There are some really important considerations that we need to make when we're thinking about developing and writing our IEP goals so that it is not a barrier.
And that actually is the perfect segue to our first step in tackling inclusive goals, which is write a vision statement. So think about what are your big picture or long-term goals for your child. And I can hear people thinking like, why does that matter? I just need an IEP goal. So Dr. Solone, can you explain what a vision statement is and why it's an essential consideration for IEP goals, and specifically for our focus today, inclusive goals?
Yes, absolutely. A vision statement is a tool. It's an opportunity to really think as a family, as an IEP team, depending on how old your child is, having your child think about what are the big picture goals that you have, your child has, your IEP team has for your child's future. And a vision statement allows us to write out those things. What are your dreams and wishes for your child? What are their own dreams and wishes for themselves? And when we have that as kind of our anchor, then we can always return to that anchor to figure out what steps we need to take to really allow it to come to fruition.
A vision statement can be epic, but it also can be as simple as, I want my child to be surrounded by people they love, to be happy and healthy, to be able to, go to the store and, use a credit card, to be able to, have a conversation, with people around them. Or it could be, I want them to be able, to go to college and to have, a healthy relationship and to advocate for themselves. I mean, it can be, because I know I hear from a lot of parents with younger kids who it's like, I have no idea. And I don't, like, sometimes parents can almost think of a vision statement as almost being like painful to think about. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you just want to say something to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think oftentimes the more simple, the better for vision statements, right? We don't know what the future holds. We really have no idea. And we don't know what our child's dreams and hopes are for their future. So the broader we can be, oftentimes the better when we're thinking about a vision statement. And when, exactly to your point, what you were saying about, surrounded by a loving community, has close friends, has the ability to, go into a store and pay for their groceries using whatever modality works for them, maybe with support or not. But it is really difficult to envision what that future might hold. And you don't have to, I think, get caught up in the what ifs when writing a vision statement. Instead, just think about, ultimately, at the end of the day, what are a few of the most important things in anybody's life, right? Contributing to society, having a strong social network, or at least a core group of people who really care about you and you care about them, right? Like thinking about what are the top 3 or 4 most important things for you, for your family, for your child, from their perspective, and then going from there. So yes, it can be really easy to get caught up in all the either catastrophizing or what ifs, or going off of what everybody else around you is saying all the time, but just take a step back and really just allow yourself to think about what matters most and just move from there.
Once you start imagining that, whether you're writing it down, whether it's in your head, right? We have the vision statement. And we know now what all goals should be working towards, just like you said. And so now we have to think about what we want our child to accomplish over the next year in school that moves us closer to that vision. So step 2, you identify, what do you want your child to do? And so for an OT goal, maybe your child needs help with fine motor and holding a pencil, or for PT, they need to learn to access the playground equipment safely. But for academic goals, how can we identify what we want our kids to do in gen ed if they aren't performing at grade level?
In general ed, when we're talking about academic goals, all students with their IEP goals, no matter what level they're working at and what their skills are, all of their IEP goals that are academic should be aligned with the general education standards, the standards that are addressed in the age equivalent classroom. So if a child's 8, for example, no matter what setting they're in, if they would traditionally be in 3rd grade, then they would be working on 3rd grade standards. And if a student's not able to meet those standards, which it happens all the time for students with and without IEPs, then we would want to take a look at the common core connectors and the essential understandings that are connected to those. And you'll take a look. So what is your vision statement? What are the standards for that grade level? Scan through the standards for the grade level. What are the most important standards that are going to allow us to get to the next step on our way to the vision statement? What are the things that are going to be addressed throughout the year, not just in one single unit? What are the really important skills that roll over from year to year across grade level? And you might be thinking as parents, I don't know, I'm not an educator, right? And that's absolutely fair. If you just take a look at the standards and start to read through them, see which ones stand out as being really meaningful and useful skills, you don't have to be an expert or an educator to start to look through those and think critically about the big picture. And sometimes that's what gets lost when teachers or IEP teams are writing their IEP goals. It can become real tunnel vision because teachers are in the classroom all day long and they're, working on, they're working on this certain novel or a certain unit in math, maybe graphing, right? And they're so tunnel vision. So then oftentimes we get tunnel vision type IEP goals. And when that happens, then it becomes really more challenging to implement or work on those IEP goals within the context of a general education classroom that's moving through content and curriculum at a pretty quick pace.
To simplify that, even further, let's say your child's in 5th grade and you want them to read more words and you don't really, like you said, we're not teachers, you don't even know really what to request. So all that you do know is that your child might be getting similar goals each year, maybe adding a few more sight words each year, or doing leveled reading from a younger grade. So to get some ideas for more inclusive standards-based goals, you can consult that handy list of core connectors, look at your child's grade level, maybe the year before, and then identify and discuss the skills that they need to participate in that curriculum throughout the year. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's right.
Skill,
Okay.
and then think about what supports they're going to also need. And so think about the big picture, think about what you want them to be able to do, how it's connecting to that ultimate vision, and then thinking about what supports they're going to need to reach those goals, where they're going to be working on those goals, and kind of what components in the goal can we tweak so that it can be really relevant to any setting.
Just to clarify everything you just said, if a student requires modifications or modified grades, they can still receive the standards-based goals that are adapted for their appropriate level in that gen ed setting, correct?
Yes, all students should have access to the general education curriculum, and all IEP goals should be aligned with that curriculum.
Exactly. And so then, which does bring us then to that third step of how can your child be in that classroom, right? So we have our vision statement, we've identified what we want our kids to do. And so now we have to consider the supports that our children need to reach that goal. So, but first, what kinds of supports can be critical for inclusion?
So the supports that are critical for inclusion are things like working with peers, thinking about like what different aspects, like what different tools, technology, assistive technology, what different tools does the student need to really thrive in that setting and reach those goals? What are kind of some, they're bypass strategies, but they're also, they're tools that are helpful for students for accessing their curriculum, right? So what types of tools do they need to be successful? Who are they working with in the classroom, and in what context are they being able to achieve these goals?
Are there some examples that you could throw out that are, accommodations or modifications that can make a child successful in a gen ed setting where traditionally teams might say can't happen? They need to be in a specialized environment, but actually with the right supports, they can be supported in that gen ed room.
Things like a calculator, a word bank, a label maker if dexterity is challenging and you're wanting to fill in the blanks, speech to text capability, access to a laptop, a computer, or different applications that support with writing. There's lots and lots and lots that we can do, and so many tools that we have nowadays to help with access. Different things like using certain pencil grips or utensils in the classroom, or typing instead of writing, different things like that. I can't tell you how many times like writing my sister's name was her IEP goal. So she will be able to write her name. And that was her IEP goal for probably, I don't know, gosh, like 6-7 years. And in high school, she still was having difficulty writing her name. And so it's important to think about, okay, well, that doesn't need to be a barrier, right? If she's expected to write her name on every single worksheet and say she was included, then it would likely cause challenging behavior and different things like that. So just give her a name stamp, right? Or be okay with the way that she's writing her name, right? So different tools like that to increase efficiency while also working on the skills. So you don't want to just give up on certain skills, right? You want to have certain strategic times to work on them, but you don't need to be working on physical act of handwriting, for example, during time to like composition time, when students are writing an essay. If that's a really challenging skill for a student, they might have the access to be able to dictate their essay or fill in the blanks and have kind of a sentence frame, or put together sentences in the right order, right? And so doing things like that can help a student access the curriculum rather than be struck by the barrier of the physical act of writing, if that makes sense.
Well, and mastering kind of, which I know we heard early on in my daughter's journey as well, and a lot of parents do, of, well, you haven't mastered this goal, so you're not ready to go into that classroom yet, right? Like goals are really, sometimes they can be used on their own is a barrier of like, well, you didn't get there yet. Like there's some tests that you have to pass to be able to get into that gen ed class. Is there
Right.
anything you want to say about that?
Well, that there's not. There's simply not a test that you have to pass, and there's no eligibility for being in general education. If a child can thrive more in a gen ed setting, and that's where they can be pushed and excel to the greatest extent possible, and we're able to provide them with the supports that they need in that setting, then that is their least restrictive environment, and that is the setting that they belong in. If a student is, saying, that they want to be pulled out to work on certain things, or, they're working on articulation and speech, then yeah, sure, a different setting might be more appropriate in those little cases, but it's oftentimes should be kind of the flip-flopped, where oftentimes we think of students receiving special education services as needing to go elsewhere, and that's when they're really getting what they need. And if they're in a special day classroom or resource classroom or speech therapy room, then they're actually getting the interventions and support that they deserve, when in fact a lot of that, the majority of that, can happen in gen ed and should happen in gen ed. And when it does happen well in gen ed, we see kids really thrive and really make great gains.
And then for you also had mentioned like a who, right? It could be what supports and it could be a who, which definitely also brings up the aid. So I just wanted to make sure to touch on that, because also it can't be used as an excuse of like, well, your child can't sit in a class and do things on their own without help. Well, then, there could be an aid, and whether that's a classroom aid or a one-on-one aid. So is there something you want to, again, we don't want those needed supports to be used as a barrier. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that for aids as well, which can be crucial.
For students with more significant support needs, an aid in a gen ed classroom can absolutely be crucial and necessary. There are some times when we don't want to rely on aids. We want our students, our children, to be as independent as possible. Sometimes an aid can be a crutch. Sometimes an aid can result in learned helplessness, where a child learns that if they pretend like they don't know or don't work for long enough, then the aid's going to do it for them. So there's a lot of reliance on that, but it can be such a helpful tool to have. So yes, in your IEP goals, the who can be included into an IEP goal, where it identifies whether a student's performing that goal in the context of a group of peers or with adult support and things like that. Or, after a teacher checks in and makes sure the student is set up for success, the student will X, Y, and Z, right? So really building in those supports to the IEP goal to make sure that a student's not just expected to meet the IEP goal without the supports that they need. Right. And then we see oftentimes that will then lead to justification for removal from general education, right? So we really want to kind of build in those safeguards into the IEP goals, so that when it comes time to reviewing the goals at the annual IEP or during progress reporting periods, then you have data that hopefully reflects those goals and how they're being met with the supports that are embedded into the goals.
Darcy had a question. She said, what if a school keeps saying that your student does best in small groups, and that is why they must be in a special day class versus gen ed, and therefore refusing aid support?
Yeah, I would say this is tricky. And I've dealt with this with districts in the past, where they're really making the case for why the student needs to be in a different setting, and really making the case for why they don't want to try a roundabout way for why they don't want to provide an aid. And if a child's least restrictive environment, if where they're going to thrive, and if you have data, or that environment is where they can thrive best, then they not wanting to provide an aid in gen ed is not an excuse. And only because they do well in small groups is not an excuse for removal from gen ed. Now, I have seen it where the small groups and pull out time, if a school, or if the data is showing that a student is really thriving in that environment, and making progress on their IEP goals, and then maybe has an opportunity in gen ed and isn't thriving in the same way, that then schools will use that as justification. But I would ask them what data they have to support that the student does better in that setting, as opposed to a general education setting. Or yes, and if they have data to support that, is it comparative? And if it was comparative, is the student receiving the same supports in gen ed as they were receiving in a separate classroom? So asking questions from the district and really trying to get the data. And sometimes that's tricky because people aren't always providing the right supports in gen ed. Sometimes it's tricky because it depends on who's taking the data and what their motives are sometimes, right? So it's definitely a tricky situation. And in that case, if it's really difficult to get fully in gen ed, then thinking about, okay, so maybe my child does better in this setting, they're saying in math and reading perhaps, can we make sure that they're then pulled out for just math block, just reading block, and it's not on the RSP or whoever's the teacher, their schedule, but it's really following along with the student's schedule in that classroom, so they're not missing out on other subjects.
But what about the kids who there isn't data because they've always been in special ed, but a special ed classroom, but they want to try that. So there isn't data. And they might say, well, they're making progress in their special ed classroom, but they haven't been given that opportunity.
I would say a reminder IEP teams that IDEA says that all students with IEP should be included in general education and learning alongside non-disabled peers for the greatest extent possible. And we can kind of safeguard our IEPs by considering how to write our goals in ways that can be worked on in gen ed. So then we can make the justification for, okay, well, maybe we're not going to make that full transition and be in gen ed for like the majority of the day or even a huge chunk of the day, but can my child be in gen ed for history, for science, for readers workshop, which is individualized and lots of schools use it, right? And can my child be in there just for certain parts of the day so we can see how it goes? And when we have our inclusive IEP goals already created and making sure that those are the way that the goals are written, we can kind of mitigate the barrier that oftentimes is, well, your child needs to work on goal work and that can't be done in gen ed.
Isabel had, another really a question that unfortunately is common for families, which is, how do you answer a gen ed teacher who says there's a gap between her and her peers, and we're worried about this gap widening too much? The implication is that therefore this isn't the best placement for her. She's a first grader with Down syndrome, fully included in the gen ed class. She's making progress on her goals.
Yeah, she's making progress on her goals. So one thing that it's really important to remind our general ed teachers that, if your child is far below grade level, or if they're not working at the same rate and pace as their peers, that's okay. And that teachers are not expected to catch students up. And a lot of times gen ed teachers feel like they have to. And so if they feel like, oh gosh, this student, there's a huge gap and I don't know how I'm going to be able to catch them up, and now I'm starting to feel bad about my abilities as a teacher, right? And I can't tell you how many times I've seen this play out. And once teachers hear that your job is not to catch this student up to grade level, your job is to support this student in making progress on their goals and progress in the curriculum at their own rate and pace. And it's okay if that looks different from everybody else, but reminding teachers of that and giving them the permission to accept that can go such a long way. And oftentimes it needs a little reinforcement. So you say it once and it comes up again, say it again, comes up again, say it a couple times. Don't give up on reminding teachers of that, because it can just be that automatic kind of tendency for teachers to go down that path. And a lot of that stems from our kind of punitive system for teachers historically around testing and if students aren't at grade level and how that penalizes teachers. And so there's some roots there that have to be dismantled a little bit.
Anu just made a follow-up question. She said, so the main argument would be that my child can make progress / could possibly make progress on their goals in a gen ed classroom.
Absolutely. In fact, oftentimes, if you're writing really intentional goals and having inclusion in mind when you're writing them, children can make more progress on their IEP goals because we've considered the big picture, considered the environment, and now we have many opportunities to work on these goals throughout the day rather than just during math centers at station 3.
Yeah.
So for example, if a student is learning to, it's really also about thinking differently about our goals. So often when I first started teaching, I would write really specific goals. We'll solve 2-digit math problems, using a checklist, things like that, right? And when we do that, it becomes really narrow. And if you can imagine what that would look like in a special day classroom or a resource classroom, it would probably look like whiteboard or some worksheets that have those types of problems and very rote and redundant skill work. If we think about what is it we want our child to be able to do, we want them to be able to recognize math equations, recognize what operation needs to be performed, and be able to then solve that problem either by hand, by using a checklist, by using a calculator to get the sum. Maybe we want them to practice solving it and then check their answer using a calculator, right? And so when we think differently about our IEP goals, we're really thinking about how are we building the skills my child needs to thrive, rather than I need my child to do this really rote skill and be a master of that. What often happens is we don't always have the best ways of measuring student progress, especially students with more significant support needs. And so what often happens is that we're working on these really rote skills. I mean, children are getting sick of it, right? Year after year after year. And if we don't have great tools to measure it, and our tools are saying, okay, or we haven't put the right supports in place, and our data is saying, okay, the student's not meeting this goal, or making a slower progress, then we just keep building these like baby steps, right? And they're just really small incremental steps. And oftentimes the children aren't super excited about doing that work. But when we take a step back and say, okay, the skill is identify the problem, the operation, find the solution, and check the answer, something like that, then you can apply that to all sorts of different types of math problems across any unit, right? And if a child can master that skill, then we got a lot to work with.
Now we have the vision statement, we have our goal, our supports. So now we can underline some of the necessary elements that both support and require an inclusive setting, and we can write those directly into specific goals. So step 4 is use language within your goals that requires an inclusive environment. And this wouldn't be appropriate for every goal, but Dr. Solone, if you can explain really what that means and give us some examples of where this could make sense.
Yes, absolutely. And again, to reiterate, this wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for every goal. And if you're trying to be really specific about the where, you might get a lot of pushback from your IEP team, depending. But for example, you could say an IEP goal could be something like, while participating in 8th grade biology, John will be able to name and describe 4 big ideas from each biology unit. Right? Using and then adding in some really specific examples about, when provided with 10 options, we'll be able to pick out 4 of the big ideas from the biology unit. And then that's replicable, right? Like you can, it's important to understand what are the big ideas that we're learning here. And Or maybe you want to have an IEP goal about the scientific method, right? Will I be able to identify the steps of a scientific method, but making sure you add in there, like where the student should be working on it. You can say things like, when working with a group of non-disabled peers, John will follow the steps of the science lab and be able to outline the steps and have a peer check their work, right? Things like that. So really thinking about, what does the goal imply? And so I really like that question that's in the chat about the setting and how so many goals are written to be in a specialist setting. And that oftentimes happens because it's how it's always happened, right? And it's what the norm has always been for so long. And so thinking about the setting, what specifically, where am I saying the student is meeting this goal in? The different groups, like when working in a cooperative group with 2 to 4 non-disabled peers, Jane will be able to take turns in 4 out of 5 opportunities. That really gives the opportunity for flexibility and repeated practice in many different contexts. So it's also really powerful for generalization too, because you're not just working on social skills or academic skills in one specific context, but you're working on a bigger set of skills across multiple contexts and with peers and in groups and in natural settings that are going to lend themselves well for a child's ability to thrive later in life.
Another natural place for language to be written in goals too are speech goals. Can you just sort of give an example of how that can sound?
When playing a game with peers, and sometimes, you can add non-disabled peers if you want to be sure that the student is really having access to those non-disabled peers, which the law suggests is very important and should be happening.
Or both, right? Peers or non-disabled, peers and non-disabled peers,
yes.
right? Just so.
Yes, and not to diminish the importance of having friends who are like us, right? And having those strong relationships with other students with disabilities too. There's like that is a beautiful thing. It should be happening for sure. But when we're talking about inclusion, these are the kind of the tricks to make sure that that's happening in the setting we want. But in terms of a speech goal, that can happen in the context of an inclusive environment, whether it's in the classroom or on the playground, is when engaged in cooperative groups with non-disabled peers, Joey will engage in four reciprocal exchanges with his peers, with prompting from the adult that's facilitating the cooperative group, right? As opposed to when asked certain questions with a speech and language pathologist, Johnny will respond in the right way, right? Or however those often sound. So really taking it into the natural environment and setting it up in a way that is going to really allow for that reciprocity and flexibility.
Another huge goal area to consider is behavior goals. So behavior is a frequent barrier, as many of us know, to inclusion. So can behavior goals actually help support inclusion?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I know we've said this, maybe sound like broken records, but behavior is not a barrier to inclusion. And there's no precursors. You don't have to graduate or have a certain skill set in terms of behavior to enter a general education classroom. So yes, behavior goals are great and can be very supportive in gen ed. And really thinking about what supports my child needs, like what are those kind of the roots of the behavior, and how can we address that through a goal, and how can we give my child the supports they need to really thrive in that setting in terms of like the behavioral supports and whether it's adult support or peer support or using certain structures.
If they do have behavioral issues, can they be in full gen ed, or can they be in full gen ed other than just art and music?
Yes, absolutely. Of course, it takes time. Any new environment will take time. And a child, setting is not going to switch a child's behavior most likely overnight. But when we add in those proper supports, it can change over time. And oftentimes what we see is that, some children don't prefer a gen ed classroom, but some really do. And when we switch their setting and put those supports in place and follow through and are consistent and give them what they need, that they can really thrive. And then you notice that their behavior just improves substantially because they have 30 peer role models all around them. Not always, but they have so many role models. They have motivation to do the things that are asked of them when put in place properly. They have just built-in reinforcement around them at all times. And it really goes a long way. And I think as educators, we can oftentimes get lost in the fear of the what if, like, oh, this child has behavior, so they can't be in gen ed. It's going to disrupt everyone else. Well, you walk into gen ed classrooms and, the kids with IEPs are not the only ones that have challenging behavior. And oftentimes the challenging behaviors that are oftentimes reported on or complained about, when it comes down to it, are not behaviors from kids with IEP. So sometimes they are, but that's okay. We have to really figure out what is the function of it and what supports are put in place. So if we're thinking about inclusive IEP goals around behavior, it's also thinking about, you can embed in supports that will help with behavior to IEP goals that are academic, social, different. They don't just have to be behavior. So when Johnny has access to fidget options, Johnny will use one of them during the lesson and will attend to the lesson. And, instead of calling out or instead of hitting the desk, or, really thinking about what are those replacement behaviors that are pro-social that we all really engage in, but don't notice. Like, what do we do when we're in a long meeting and we're tired, but we want to be respectful? Like, what are those adaptive strategies that we can give our kids so that they can, learn to thrive in their settings and feel good about being where they are?
If an IEP team doesn't know how to write goals to include a child in the gen ed setting who might not be on grade level, or maybe they just need heavier accommodations for a specific learning disability, what do we do? Do we whip out our goal templates and, make some copies and pass them around the table? What do we do if, there's no malice, but they don't know what to do or where to start?
Yeah. And that's a very real problem. And that's when it's so important to really remember that our IEP team is a team. And oftentimes parents don't feel like that because of the way it's been and structured and administration and all of that stuff, right? But yes, help your IEP team to learn. And many teachers are not ill-intentioned, but don't have the skills or knowledge or understanding. So yes, give them the goal template. Yes, show them the Common Core state standards with the Common Core connectors and the essential understandings, and show them how much easier it can be to imagine what a child might be doing or working on in the context of their classroom at their skill level. And when you give them those tools, I would imagine, and anytime I've given teachers these tools, they've been blown away by how awesome those resources are, wishing that they had been aware of them sooner.
And I also think we definitely need to touch on who is responsible for overseeing and implementing your child's goals in an inclusive class.
You'll have to check with your team for who they think is responsible. So I would ask your team who they think is responsible for implementing, taking data, managing the goals. And that would be then a conversation to have with the team about how to really strategize and make sure that Johnny is working on these goals in certain environment, and that it's been planned for, and that, during these different units that are coming up, how are we going to, how is Johnny going to access these units coming up, and how can we connect his goals with the unit, and how can we really ensure that he's getting strategic practice in a way that's meaningful for Johnny.
I want to touch really quickly on socialization, which obviously is a core to a lot of what we're talking about, but with non-academic goals like socialization, seems like obvious places to be inclusive, but a lot of families don't think to include these kind of goals in an IEP. So are there some examples that we should consider to put into our IEPs that promote that?
That promote the socialization? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thinking about like what types of skills should my child have with other peers, right? And so thinking about what happens during the day. Well, all the kids come in the classroom during the day. And if my child is working on greeting, like that would be a very appropriate goal to have, perhaps, in, having those reciprocal exchanges. What else happens all the time? Group work, oftentimes, right? Sharing happens, right? Sharing out, taking turns happens all the time. Let's see. Having those reciprocal exchanges. I think those reciprocal exchanges are really, really important too. And then, just peer work or group work. So you can distinguish between the two: peer work, group work, and thinking about like, what are those skills within that time? If I'm getting reports that during group work, Johnny is having challenges working with his peers or getting upset when things don't go his way, then thinking about, okay, well, what can I add in? So when students break up into groups and are working on cooperative group work with priming and with specific group work rules that have been reviewed with Johnny, Johnny will, follow the rules and utilize this replacement behavior when he gets frustrated, or will communicate in an appropriate way with his peers when things are challenging or frustrating, right? So thinking about, okay, what are those specific things that happen in a classroom all the time, and what is my child really thriving in, and what are some areas for growth? What's the next area for growth? And how do I implement the strategies needed into the goal so that they can be successful in that setting? And so that we can make sure that the adults in that setting are actually implementing those things too.
And I also, when you were talking, I was thinking about setting too, about like recess or lunch, or also, organic parts, non-academic parts of the day also, that you could, naturally build that in when kids are socializing, to also make sure that if your child doesn't want to be, that they're not, sitting in their, and maybe in their special education class with just their class for lunch, or that they are joining specials like art and things, and they're going to PE with other kids, or, and with PE, like maybe you're in its, peer models, just really, again, writing those kind of things into all of the settings for whatever makes sense.
Yeah. Yes. The lunch thing, it's so wild to see so many schools still segregating their lunch tables.
Yep.
And I can't tell you how many times I've heard kids who really want to go sit at their third grade class's lunch table, and the aides or the teachers won't let them. Yeah. And so, those are, if that's going on for you, or that is the tendency at your school, and your child wants to eat lunch with peers at their grade level who are not maybe in their classroom specifically. Different schools have different rules, but considering writing that into your goal, like when sitting with third grade class during lunch, Johnny will sit next to a peer and will, whatever the thing that Johnny's needing on at that time.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Sitting with friends where he wants.
Yeah.
Right. Myra had a question. She said, how do you address or request for the gen ed teacher to offer feedback on how your child is doing in their class? My daughter's special ed teacher reports progress on goals, but my daughter's working on math and language arts in gen ed, and I receive little to no info on how she's doing.
And you can write that in your IEP too. In the goals, when you say as measured by like teacher charted data, or, as measured by, teacher charted data that's sent home in weekly notebooks or monthly data checks or something like that. But yeah, I would just have a candid conversation with the general education teacher and ask, what is the easiest way for you to give me information about this? Would you prefer sending me an email monthly, or sending me like writing back and forth in a notebook that I send to school with my child? Or would you prefer I text you or you text me? Or would you prefer to give me like the login information for their apps that I can check? Or, just have that dialogue, because every teacher's style is different. And, for some teachers, getting back to emails or remembering to email at the end of the week can be really challenging. Other teachers are super good at it. So really playing on our teachers' strengths and asking for their input on how to best get you what you're looking for. And I will say that the reality is, gen ed teacher is not going to be able to take all this data and send it to you weekly. Like, that's just not going to happen. But what is it that you want to know? And what is it that's really like important for you to know? And what's the frequency that makes sense, practically speaking, and for the purposes that you're looking for to receive that information?
What are 3 red flags to look for when we're reading goals, right? We receive that IEP. What are the red flags that we could look at that, goals that would make it difficult to carry out in a gen ed setting?
So look at setting. Like, where does it say this goal is taking place? Does it have a location, right? Or not? If it doesn't have a location, that allows for some flexibility. If you want even more specificity, adding in what setting, so in the general education classroom, in the 6th grade biology lab, in, during the 6th grade lunch period, right? Really writing those in. So location is the first one. And the second is specificity. So is the goal too specific? Is it a fraction goal? If it's a fraction goal, for example, fractions only take place for 6 weeks, sometimes, depending on the grade level. So that would make it really difficult to work on in general education because it's too specific, right? So location, specificity, and the person. So an individual, I would say. So looking at who does this say that the student is going to be doing this with? Are they doing it with peers? Are they doing it with non-disabled peers? Are they doing it with an aide? Are they doing it with the teacher? Are they doing it with the speech and language pathologist? If those things are written in and it's very specific and it's kind of limiting. So location, person, and specificity. And then if you are thinking like you've identified those 3 things, you're like, okay, it says the speech room. Well, that's no good. Okay, it says just with the speech teacher. Well, that's not really going to be helpful for generalization. So maybe we want to expand it a little bit. If it says, okay, just pragmatics, like just who, what questions with the speech teacher, right? That's too specific here, right? So thinking about those 3 things are key. And then if you want to take an added layer and thinking about what supports does my child need to thrive with this skill, and how can we embed those in the goal so that they can be as successful as possible. And no one can say that they're not meeting the goal if they haven't already put those things in place, right? Because it's like, if you have accommodations listed on your IEP, great. But if they're not directly attached necessarily to certain goals, then the likelihood that they're going to be implemented 100% of the time for your child, honestly, is maybe it's slim. Mm-hmm. So if you can write those things in the goals, it also protects you from having a more solid IEP goal that can then be more likely to be met and less likely to be used as justification for lack of progress and things like that. And I would say, like, don't stress about this, right? Like, if you could just take a look at one of your child's goals, just take a look at one of them and see how you could tweak one goal. And then the next IEP cycle, maybe really tackle two of the most important ones that you're adjusting, right? Or maybe you feel like you have the capacity to tackle more, right? But don't put that pressure on yourself to really like hold an amendment right away, change all your IEP goals. This is food for thought, and it's an evolution. Like, we're always learning and growing, and it's okay if it's not perfect right now. It will never be perfect, right? We are learning all the time, and we're learning new things all the time. When I look back to IEPs I wrote my first couple of years of teaching, even the last couple of years of teaching, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of things that I would do differently. And when you know more, you know better, you can do better, and we can't do it all.
We want to optimize our kids' goals so they can be meaningful members of their classes, their schools, and beyond. And so just remember exactly what you were saying, Dr. Solone, when you feel overwhelmed, just remember those 4 steps, right? Vision statement. What are they going to do? What supports do they need? And how can I write inclusion into these specific goals? So, if it still feels like a lot, just grab that template that we provided and just, really work your way through that, which, really breaks it down. And if you'd like to work on that with somebody, we can help with that. So if you want or need deeper support and a one-on-one guide to talk through these 4 steps or get those goals into shape or explore other ways that you can advocate for more inclusion, our Undivided navigators would love to walk you through it. Our mission is to support you so your children can thrive, but we want you to thrive too. So if you need help, please reach out.